how does a monopoly maximize its profits? What's its optimal price like, and how does that relate to the elasticity of demand? The dead weight loss created by monopoly, and we'll look at that both in theory and in the data, empirical measurements of it, as well as how taxes are passed through to consumers under monopoly. We'll then talk about price discrimination by firms, when they charge different prices to different consumers or for different amounts that you purchase. Both about perfect price discrimination, where I can exactly target how much I charge for every unit of good to each person, and why that's efficient, but also why it's hard to implement. We'll then talk about less perfect forms of price discrimination, like quantity discounts, and charging different prices to different groups of people or in different countries. And I'll talk about some of the applications of that to thinking about tax policy. Then we'll turn to firms' choice of quality. How does a monopoly choose what quality of product, not just how much of a product to supply? And how that relates to the value that marginal consumers versus average consumers place on the product. And that will allow us to analyze what are called spatial theories of competition, but also of not just competition between producers, but also competition between different political parties. And how that helps predict the way that political parties tend to act during elections. We'll then talk about policy towards monopolies, in particular the regulation of monopolies, which is particularly important when there's a natural monopoly, when it's natural for there just to be one firm in the industry. And talk about different forms of regulation based on average costs and marginal costs. The information problems that arise in trying to do that type of regulation, the information you need to have about costs. Well, this has gone down. I'm just going to talk to you. We'll talk about monopolistic competition and free entry, and about its relationship to average cost pricing, and then connect that up with medical insurance and a number of issues related to the new Health Reform Act that was passed last year. I'll then talk about intellectual property, and how the monopoly profits created by intellectual property act as an incentive to create new innovative products. When that incentive serves a beneficial role, and when that incentive serves a harmful role, as we were talking about earlier, and how that relates to the dynamics of competition. I'll then talk about intellectual property as a policy tool, and what the optimal extent of intellectual property is, trading off the harms that come from the monopoly it creates with the benefits it creates in terms of the products that it incentivizes the creation of. I'll then also talk about alternative things to intellectual property. Then we'll turn to oligopoly. Rather than there just being one firm or perfect competition, we'll talk about imperfect competition between a small number of firms. Thinking about how firms should behave in an oligopoly, some alternative models of that, including Cournot's model, the Edgeworth-Bertrand model, and the Stackelberg model, as well as broader models such as conjectural variations, and the theory of collusion between firms. We'll then talk about competition policy and how it can help deal with some of the problems arising from oligopolies, the effect that competition has on prices, how increased competition helps drive us towards efficiency, and eventually perfect competition. General lessons we can take away from these things about the role that competition plays. The role of competition law and restrictions on firms' ability to merge or collude with one another, and how this helps promote competition, and how you can evaluate in a particular case whether a merger should be allowed. I'll then finally talk about public policies like redistribution of wealth and public goods, In particular, we'll talk about global and domestic inequality and how this has been growing in recent years, and talk about some of the arguments for why we should redistribute wealth, in particular this idea of the veil of ignorance. We'll then talk about utilitarianism as a framework for thinking about what's the right amount of redistribution to do. And that will rely on the notion of risk aversion, and so we'll do a refresher on risk aversion. And we'll try to determine using a model what the optimal level of redistribution is, what the optimal level of progressive taxation is. And we'll use some empirical data to help calibrate this and to think about, in the real world, what optimal income tax policy should be. Finally, we'll talk about public goods and the problems that are created when every person is sort of a monopolist on their contribution to the public good, how this gets worse and worse the more people that there are, and how eventually this leads, if there's a lot of people, public projects to be really neglected, and people not to make large contributions if their interests in something are very diffuse. We'll talk about the possibility that requiring everyone to contribute or nothing will happen can help solve this, and why this doesn't really work. That will finish up the course. So thanks so much for coming today. I'll see you all on Thursday.